6 hours ago, in the most dangerous waterway on Earth, an Iranian commander looked out across the gray morning and saw exactly what he had been praying for. One lone American destroyer, cut loose from the rest of the fleet, gliding toward the Strait of Hormuz as if nothing in the world could touch it. So he raised his hand and sent 30 fast attack boats straight at it. For one brief, intoxicating moment, he believed he was about to make history. 30 small, fast, angry boats against a single U.S. warship. A swarm against a giant. A trap against a target. A revenge story waiting to be filmed. Then he lifted his binoculars toward the American bridge, ready to watch the panic begin. And what he saw didn't make sense. The destroyer hadn't turned. It hadn't slowed. It hadn't even acknowledged that 30 armed boats were charging it across one of the most strategic waterways on the planet. That was the moment the commander should have understood something was terribly wrong. Because the American ship wasn't ignoring him. It had already solved him. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand where it happened. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another patch of water. It is one of the world's great choke points, a narrow corridor through which a massive share of global oil and energy traffic has to pass. If this waterway closes, markets panic, insurance rates explode, fuel prices jump, and suddenly a confrontation between a few boats becomes everybody's problem. That is why every threat in Hormuz carries more weight than the number of hulls involved. Iran knows that. The United States knows that. And every navy that sails there knows one simple truth. In Hormuz, even a small move can echo around the world. Which is exactly why the commander believed the Americans would hesitate. His logic was simple. Crude but simple. One destroyer cannot point its guns everywhere at once. One warship cannot physically block attackers coming from every angle. And one captain facing 30 closing contacts in a confined waterway might freeze just long enough for the swarm to get inside the wire. That was the theory. And on paper, to anyone impressed by numbers, it looked persuasive. 30 is a big number. 1 is a small number. Most people stop thinking right there. Professionals do not. The Iranian commander had likely spent years imagining this exact picture. Not a fair fight. Not a fleet engagement. Not a clean naval duel. A spectacle. A heavily armed American destroyer humiliated by cheap, fast, disposable boats. A propaganda masterpiece. The kind of footage that runs on loop for weeks. The kind of story that makes a regional force look larger than life. And that confidence matters because overconfidence changes how people move. It makes them louder. It makes them faster. It makes them stop checking what they missed. So the order went out. Split the swarm. Push hard from multiple bearings. Force the destroyer to choose. Overload its sensors. Compress its reaction time. Get close enough that size becomes a disadvantage. From a distance, it probably looked terrifying, 30 small wakes spreading across the water in multiple lanes, engines screaming, bows slamming through the chop, machine guns and rockets pointed toward a ship weighing thousands of tons more than anything in the Iranian formation. This is the psychological power of swarm tactics. The point is not elegance. The point is stress. Make the enemy track too much. Make him decide too fast. Make the situation feel bigger than it is. And if the enemy panics, the swarm wins before the first real shot lands. But the destroyer did not panic. That was the first sign the entire script in the commander's head had already gone bad. There is something deeply unsettling about a warship that refuses to look impressed. The American destroyer kept its line. Same heading. Same speed. Same cold indifference. No wild maneuvering. No theatrical warning shots. No visible scramble. Nothing that would reassure the attackers that they were forcing the pace. To the commander, this probably looked like paralysis. To the American crew, it looked like procedure. And that is the core mistake weaker forces make when they face advanced naval systems. They often confuse calm with vulnerability. But calm is not vulnerability when it comes from training, radar integration, air support, weapons layering, and a doctrine built around killing threats before they become immediate problems. The destroyer did not need to start reacting when the boats became visible. It had been reacting long before the commander ever felt clever. This is where the battle stops being a movie in the commander's head and starts becoming a systems problem he cannot win. Because the destroyer is not fighting alone just because it is sailing alone. That distinction matters. Modern naval combat is layered. A destroyer's strength is not just the steel in its hull or the missiles in its cells. Its strength is the network around it. Sensors, helicopters, tactical doctrine, engagement zones, overlapping weapons, and the kind of crew coordination that turns seconds into advantages. And out ahead of that destroyer, beyond the emotional horizon of the men in the speedboats, were the first pieces of the answer. Helicopters. Not cinematic decorations. Not backup. Weapons platforms. The swarm had focused on the destroyer because that was the biggest thing it could see. Professionals worry about what they can't see. By the time the boats were charging in, the American air crews likely had a cleaner picture of the engagement than the attackers did. They could see the columns form. They could see the spacing. They could identify lead elements, density, and intent. And most importantly, they could strike the swarm before the swarm reached the range where it became complicated. That is the cruel difference between a tactic and a kill chain. Tactic is an idea. A kill chain is what happens to your idea when the other side has already connected detection, classification, targeting, and engagement before you finish accelerating. Then the first column died. Not metaphorically. Not gradually. Functionally. The left side of the Iranian formation, charging hard and convinced it was overwhelming one American ship, suddenly found itself under attack from an angle it had not emotionally prepared for. And that matters because surprise at sea is not just about where something appears. It is about when your brain accepts that the situation has changed. That acceptance always comes late. The first boats don't get time to understand. The boats behind them get just enough time to panic. In swarm tactics, momentum is everything. Once the front fractures, the psychology of the whole formation starts to rot. Men who were seconds ago participating in an aggressive advance now become witnesses. Witnesses become doubters. Doubters become traffic. And traffic under fire becomes wreckage. That is how fast naval confidence collapses. Not in speeches. In spacing. In hesitation. In one column suddenly failing to keep moving like a column. And through all of it, the destroyer still does not look hurried. That visual is devastating. Because now the commander is forced to process two humiliations at once. First, his formation is taking losses. Second, the ship he came to intimidate still seems emotionally uninvolved. That is not a battle anymore. That is a lesson. This is the part nobody likes to talk about after the fact. Not the explosions. The radio. Because combat sounds impressive in retellings. On comms it usually sounds like confusion. Status calls. Broken reports. Overlapping voices. Half-finished warnings. Questions shouted by men who need answers faster than answers exist. That is how command begins to dissolve. The commander can still issue orders, but orders are no longer enough. Once people start processing different realities at the same time, unity breaks. Some crews still think they can rush forward. Others want to turn. Others can't see clearly. Others are simply reacting to the fireball where their lead boats used to be. And while that panic spreads across the swarm, the destroyer's combat system is doing the exact opposite. Sorting. Ranking. Filtering. Assigning. Machines do not feel insulted. Systems do not get excited. And that is exactly why they are lethal. If the first wave of destruction shocks a formation, the second wave breaks its faith. That is the moment when men stop believing the original plan still exists. Another American aircraft appears. Another angle. Another strike. More boats erased before they can make the fight close and ugly. Now the commander's remaining force is not a swarm. It is debris, fear, and a few surviving engines still pointed in the wrong direction. This is the hidden weakness inside every cheap boats beat expensive ship fantasy. Cheap boats only look dangerous as a mass. Once that mass gets separated, delayed, or reduced, each surviving craft becomes what it always was. Small, exposed, and fragile. A fast attack boat looks menacing in propaganda footage. It looks very different when isolated under the eyes of a modern warship. Now imagine being one of the last boats still charging. The boats beside you are gone. The radio is chaos. The ship ahead of you is still coming. And you are finally close enough to understand the worst part. You have not cornered the destroyer. You have entered its preferred geometry. This is where the engagement becomes brutally unfair. Because the helicopters are not the destroyer's last answer. They are its outer answer. The inner answer is what happens when a fast, hostile contact survives long enough to get inside the distance where the ship stops tolerating uncertainty. At that point, the warship's close-in defenses exist for one purpose: remove incoming threats before those threats become impacts. That kind of weapon is not built for theater. It is built for deletion. 4 men in a fast fiberglass boat, that realization arrives far too late. 1 second you are still part of an attack. The next second you are simply the closest object on the wrong side of a weapons envelope. And once a modern defensive system decides you belong in that category, individual courage stops mattering. Pride stops mattering. Speeches stop mattering. Revolutionary slogans stop mattering. You are no longer fighting a ship. You are being processed by it. That is the real horror of advanced naval warfare for smaller forces. It strips romance out of the engagement. It reduces bravado to signatures, speeds, vectors, and distance. You are not a symbol. You are a closing contact. And closing contacts get dealt with. By now, whatever image the commander had brought into the battle is gone. No glorious interception. No shattered American morale. No triumphant footage back at port. Only wreckage, spray, smoke, screaming comms, and the sickening discovery that the enemy never needed to rise emotionally to meet your challenge. That is the deepest humiliation in the whole story. Not that he lost, but that the Americans were never forced onto his level of chaos. He came to create a moment. They reduced him to a procedure. And that is exactly why this kind of story hits so hard with viewers. Because it is not really about boats. It is about what happens when myth collides with systems. One side believes intensity is enough. The other side has already built a machine for dealing with intensity. Guess which side survives longer? And now we arrive at the image that makes stories like this travel. The survivors scatter. Some break away. Some stop moving. Some likely hope that stillness can make them less visible, less urgent, less targetable. The destroyer, meanwhile, keeps moving through Hormuz with the same impersonal momentum it had when this all began. That visual matters because it turns the whole engagement into a statement. The waterway did not close. The ship did not retreat. The swarm did not impose a new reality. It just got in the way of one. And in the aftermath comes the detail that transforms battlefield defeat into narrative humiliation, rescue. Because dominant forces do not just destroy, sometimes they pause long enough to prove how completely they controlled the fight. Pulling a defeated commander out of the water, handing him aid, setting him back on a surviving vessel, whether treated literally or symbolically in storytelling, lands like a final message. You were never in charge of this encounter. We decided when it started. We decided how it ended. We even decided whether you got to live through it. That is not merely military victory. That is narrative ownership. And that is why this kind of clash becomes dangerous in the information war, whether every detail survives official scrutiny or not. Because stories like this do more than describe a tactical defeat. They attack a political image. They puncture the myth that harassment equals control. They expose the gap between revolutionary swagger and modern integrated warfare. They remind everyone watching that intimidation works only until it meets a force that has seen the tactic before, modeled it, trained for it, and prepared multiple ways to dismantle it. Tehran can spin defiance. It can celebrate resistance. It can replay slogans forever. What it cannot easily celebrate is this. 30 boats raced into history trying to make one destroyer blink. And the destroyer barely looked busy. That is the lesson in Hormuz. Not that small boats are harmless. They are not. In confined waters with the right conditions and enough surprise, they can be dangerous, disruptive, and politically useful. But danger is not the same thing as dominance. And spectacle is not the same thing as control. A swarm can look terrifying right up until the moment it meets a layered defense that was built specifically to turn speed, aggression, and mass into liabilities. That is what made this encounter so brutal. The commander thought he was launching an ambush. In reality, he was driving a formation of fragile boats into a battle space already mapped, watched, and quietly solved. One destroyer, 30 boats, one narrow strait, and one fatal misunderstanding. The Americans were never trapped. They were waiting.